Welcome everybody to the webinar entitled Engaging Transgender Students in Your Classroom. With us today is guest presenter Brian Patchcoski. Brian is the director of the LGBTQA Resource Center at the Pennsylvania State University. Prior to returning to Penn State, Brian served as an associate dean of students at Cornell University, focused on student support, sexual violence, and advocacy, while also directing their LGBT Resource Center. During his tenure at Cornell, Brian also co-directed the Center for Intercultural Dialogue, which was home to several advocacy centers and student support structures. He was also the founding director of the Office of LGBTQ Services and deputy title officer at Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Prior to Dickinson, Brian was the assistant director of the LGBTQA Student Resource Center at Penn State. During his career, Brian has participated in several national research projects examining student identity development and campus climate, as served as the Mid-Atlantic representative for the Consortium on Higher Education LGBT Resource. He currently serves as a commissioner on a newly formed commission on LGBTQ affairs with the Pennsylvania Governor's Office, working to foster greater inclusion and equity across the state for diverse genders and sexualities. Brian has worked extensively providing trainings and discussions exploring issues of sexuality and gender identity, and more broadly, diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education. Brian, thank you so much for joining us here today. I've asked Brian to lead this discussion actually at the request of you, fellow agri-science teachers, as part of our visits to different programs throughout the year. It was suggested and requested at one of those visits that one area of professional development that they felt was lacking and they were not able to get elsewhere was on the topic of how to interact with, address, and respectfully communicate with transgender students. And as our society continues to change and become more diverse, our student body and population is going to continue to diversify and pose new challenges to us. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian. Feel free to ask Brian any questions throughout, and he will do his best to answer them for you. So Brian, it is all you, and I'm going to mute and keep quiet.
Thanks so much, John, and thank you all for joining us today. Absolutely feel free, use the chat. I have the chat box up here, so if there's any questions too, that it would be easier if you want to type them out, that's fine too. Or feel free to unmute and get my attention. That works as well. So today, as I shared with John, I wanted to give a foundational knowledge around this, and then towards the end, I absolutely want to share some of the resources some of the tangible, practical resources that might be important, especially K through 12 environments, educational environments, because there are some, having the foundation for understanding and walking through the process and seeing what trans, non-binary, and genderqueer folks are experiencing is one part of it, but I think then actually putting it into practice, I want to give you some of those tools. And if there's things after today that I can be helpful with, please do let me know. Always feel free to reach out. John has my information, and I'm assuming he can share that, but my email, just so it's in here, is bjp226@psu.edu. So with that, I am going to see if, okay, here we go. Slides are progressing. I'm not going to do a roll call of folks on the call, but I did, thinking through some of this, again, if there are things that you want me to cover or highlight, please do put those in the chat box, and I'll try to touch on those as I go through specific areas of the conversation. When we start these conversations, I do start with foundational knowledge or ground rules in terms of discussing some of this content. I ask that folks are present, and this is harder on a tech call, but if you are thinking through these things, please do ask questions. Again, feel free to come off of mute. Feel free to send those questions in the chat box, and I'll do my best to answer those as we go forward. Take the learning experiences with you, but what is said should remain. So if there is a question that's asked and identifies a specific area that, or labels a specific area, try not to take that outside of here. I know this is a recorded webinar, but just remembering people's privacy and individual issue privacy is important when we discuss issues around diversity and inclusion. Reserve the right to change your mind. I know, as John had noted, this is something that you have all asked for in your educational endeavors. And so But our moral ground and moral experiences are vast. They are going to be in a variety of spaces and places, and so give yourself that ability to change as things do shift. And please remember, it is okay to laugh. I think some of this justice-related work is hard. I think when you work with adolescents and young adults, some of this stuff really it's hard to navigate, and laughter and humor is important in this cultural change work. And so just to give you a quick roadmap of what we'll cover in just about an hour, we're going to talk about gender messages, some foundational terminology and where that is currently progressing, pronoun usage, some of the challenges that trans and non-binary folks encounter, and especially around adolescence and puberty, and how bodies start to change, and some of the dysphoria and challenges related to that, and how you all might be better supports. What does transitioning mean, and why is this linked to mental health and psychology, as well as some of the current stats we have around trans and non-binary identities. We'll talk about some basic tips to think about inclusivity, and wrap up and, of course, address your questions along the way. So you'll see throughout the presentation, there is a series of images. These series of images are from a national photo exhibit or a global photo exhibit that travels the United States that poses questions that trans and non-binary folks have been asked. And the folks in the picture identify within the trans spectrum in some way. And so I do ask, I won't talk about these as we go through, but I do ask that if your mind is wandering or you're just staring at the slides and listening to me, think about the questions. Think about if you've asked these questions, if you've heard these questions asked in the educational environments that you work. What would you feel like if you were asked these questions? How would you engage someone who has asked these questions to a trans and non-binary student or community member? And so again, I add these in here just for us to reflect as we go through the presentation. And so to start the conversation, I do want you to think about, I know there's a good number of folks on the call. I want you to think about 3 reflection questions before we go forward. Because these experiences around trans and non-binary stuff are not just trans and non-binary individuals' issues, but thinking about gender messages and the things that we've been told in life, I want you to think about what are some of the messages you've received about gender while growing up from parents and families. So some examples, boys will be boys, girls should like pink. What are some of the messages you received about gender while growing up from peers? And what are some of the messages you received about gender from the media as you were growing up? And so I think, various messages come to mind when we think about these questions. But I do want you to carry these questions as we go through the presentation to help you frame this work. So when you're working with adolescents and youth and other community members that these issues might arise in, thinking about how gender has affected us, and whether that be, images in the media. So one of the examples that comes up in workshops often are, I watched the Golden Girls, and the Golden Girls were talking about this in the early 90s, and that was progressive then. Or we'll hear that I was, there may be a woman who's identifying in a room and saying that they were doing all of the housework in their family. But I want you to think about those things and think about how gender was kind of instructed or told to you, and then if you've always agreed with that. Because I think that's the subtle message that I want us to carry forward. When trans folks or non-binary or genderqueer folks really do start to think about gender, it usually is this feeling of my internal sense of self isn't right with how the world is telling me I should be living. And so when we think about trans issues, I really want us to think about the basic issue of my internal sense of self, again, is different than the sex assigned at birth or the birth that was told to me when I was born on record. And so that's a really basic example, but one to help us frame the conversation. And again, if there's any thoughts on reflection questions or any of that, feel free to put those in the chat box. So in terms of education, in terms of legal stuff, I did want to cover this just briefly. The last 5 or 6 years have been really an acceleration point for equity and inclusion around trans and non-binary issues. And I should call out that I'm using non-binary often. Many of our younger generations are using that term and moving away from the term transgender. Not all, but there is a good deal of folks that are using non-binary versus transgender, because historically, many folks, when you said transgender, if I was born a male, many times folks would assume that you just want to be a woman. Non-binary recognizes a much more fluid context of identity, and an ability to really shift as we shift in the world. And so just wanted to call out why I was using non-binary so often. But thinking about the legal landscape and things that have accelerated in the past few years, this dates back all the way to 2012 under Title VII, which is employment law, and really about the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, ruling that gender identity is covered under traditionally sex discrimination in the workplace. And so that was one foundational principle, that in terms of a work environment, things started to get broader. So instead of just saying sex was protected, it really was starting to talk about gender and a broader umbrella of gender. In 2014, under the Obama administration, there was an executive order that dictated that federal contractors and subcontractors, inclusive of K through 12 educational institutions and colleges and universities, had to prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. That led to many other conversations, as these entities, many of them were not ready for this type of a dictate. But the Department of Labor, the EEOC, all started to have many more conversations about what does this mean in terms of facilities? What does this mean? How do we allow folks, or how might we increase access to a variety of facilities for folks that might not fit the gender norms that we know? And so, again, there's a lot of text on these slides, but overall, it really rested in facilities and how do we allow folks to have equitable access to those facilities. Then all the way up to 2015, Title VII was also then expanded to not only gender and sex, but sexual orientation and identity. So, we can always talk offline about other legal stuff, but LGBT and marriage equality is up here as well. It didn't do much for the LGBT or the trans and genderqueer community. It was really a broader concept, but in terms of trans and non-binary issues, marriage equality wasn't a huge push or step in the direction to assist with equity in the areas that we're talking about today. In K through 12, however, along with some of the Obama administration recommendations, there was a Dear Colleague letter that was released specifically to how do we engage trans and non-binary individuals in the K through 12 environment, which also Title IX also extends to college and higher education institutions. In terms of Title IX, it really was, historically we might think about it in terms of athletics. We know that it's not just athletics, it's also sex and really discrimination based on sex in educational environments. And so this really talks about sexual violence, it talks about gender-based harassment. Over the last few years, the Department of Justice, Department of Ed, affirmed that trans students should not be singled out to use a separate or designated restroom or made to room separately. They should also be able to use chosen names and chosen pronouns in educational environments. And that Dear Colleague letter addressed a whole bunch of system changes and things that we as educational institutions should be doing to affirm our trans and non-binary youth and growing students. And so I think thinking about some of this stuff, thinking about restrooms, locker rooms, there's been lots of conversations and lots of challenges in conversations about how do we make this happen? How do we do this, especially when we're worried about people thinking that we're talking about sexual practice versus identity. And so towards the end of the presentation, I do have some stuff that I want to share with you that in terms of actual practice and thinking through some of the actual recommendations or policy stuff might be helpful, but wanted to cover some of those high-level legal and legislative changes and why some of this has come to the forefront so quickly. So moving into some of the terminology stuff and concepts of gender, trans stuff is it's gray. There's lots. Transgender as a term is a large umbrella. There's lots of stuff that fall under trans identities. It's many times added into this LGBTQIA alphabet soup acronym. but it is different than the LGB or the LGBTQ area. T is really about the genders, non-binary issues, gender queer issues, gender non-conforming issues. It's about gender versus where the lesbian, gay, bisexual stuff, the queer stuff is about sexual orientation and sexual identity. And so we lose when we add that and clump it all together, there's lots of confusion. And so for the sake of today, we're really focusing on the T or the larger gender umbrella. To help us think through this, since everything in my world, what we do, everything becomes Penn State and the Nittany Lion. This is not the Nittany Lion, this is the Pride Lion. But this is an easier teaching tool. So if you're familiar with the genderbread person or the gender unicorn, the Trans Student Educational Resources, TSER, you can Google them. They have some really great resources around basic education around sex and gender. But I do want us to have the terminology, those that are on the call today, to talk about some of this gender stuff without going down into the nitty gritty and getting lost in all of the varied terminology that truly does exist in this area. So to start that, I want us to think about gender in three ways. Gender, if we're thinking about gender for someone, we should be thinking about gender identity, gender expression, and biological sex. So that gender identity aspect is, it's pointing to the brain. It's who I know myself as in the world. Internally, maybe I see myself as a man. Maybe I see myself as a woman. Maybe I see myself as neither of those. My gender expression, as you can see there, the entire Pride Lion is represented. It's how you want yourself to be read in the world and how the world reads you. And so, in sessions with folks and students on campus here, if the Pride Lion was in a football outfit versus maybe a dress or other things, the gender expression of the lion would change. The biological sex is those hormones, chromosomes, internal, external, genitalia stuff, and all the stuff that make us the biological organisms that we are. But those three things should inform when we're thinking about a person's gender and our own gender identities. Those three things should really formulate what we are. When we think about that other area of sexual orientation, sexual identity, that's the attraction stuff. So trans people, yes, non-binary people all have attractions, as do, lesbian, gay, bisexual folks all have gender and gender identities. So it's not an either or, it's a both and. We all have these things. But trying to give us some of the working knowledge where I know the youth that I work with in middle school and high schools are way advanced and much farther along than much of our faculty and staff on these issues. And so they know the terminology and they know how they're identifying much more so than many of the populations that I work with on a day-to-day basis. So that's exciting, but also scary. Thinking about some of the terminology, again, that correlates with these areas, this is kind of the 101 section of the presentation. Gender, when we think about gender identity, we think about woman, girl, man, boy, other genders. There are hundreds of variations of gender identity. So folks can be gender queer, gender nonconforming, and we'll go over these in a second. Gender expression, we think about some of those normative values of masculinity, femininity, and then off the charts. You can be on all these charts at one time. You can be off the charts entirely. It can be agender, a, the prefix meaning not or without a gender expression or identity. And then the one that's always interesting is sex assigned at birth. And so I many times ask the folks in physical sessions, when on a form, when you ask sex, what are your categories? Many times the response is male and female. And so we know that is actually inaccurate. There are hundreds of variations of sex development. And so again, there's not just two options. And so thinking about forms, how we collect data, we have some really good recommendations here that we could always pass along to you if you're interested in designing forms and how you collect data. But so just to kind of call out in terms of intersex variation, intersex folks historically, at birth, one example would be, there was a tool called a phallometer that would measure the size of a little boy's penis at birth. If that penis was not of quote unquote standard size, that little boy would be essentially turned into a little girl at birth without all of the working internal, external genitalia functions. And many times these surgeries happened because of fear and potential bullying in the future. all of the major medical associations have said to halt these types of procedures. But we know statistically there's still 5 that happen in the US a day. And so other areas where folks may learn that they're intersex is that, later on that they're family planning, and then some genetic testing has happened. And then they learn that there's some variation in their sex development that isn't quote unquote normative. And so the number of intersex folks in the world are actually the same number as redheaded folks in the world. So if you know someone who's redheaded, you probably know someone, whether they are open about it or not, that is intersex identified. And so there has been a big resurgence and a pride happening around intersex identities and the variations in those identities that has been growing both on college campuses but below. And so, groups have been forming, and I think, we will see more conversation about this. There's some really good films and educational documentaries on the Intersex Society of North America website, as well as Netflix. So some of this has come into kind of standard language.
Brian, quick question to jump in here. Do you know and I just did this with my son almost 9 months ago here, but is there an option on birth certificate forms for other or intersex, or is there any other choice other than male or female that a parent could certify their child at birth is?
It's a real great question, actually. Nationally, there's not a consistent set of standards in terms of birth certificates. There has been historically male versus female designation. There have been states, so California, Maryland, Minnesota just started changing identity markers. And there's one, New York, I think, made these changes. New York City made it before New York State. But thinking of some of those, absolutely. So, and I talk about this with some of our admissions folks, as youth are changing documentation, which we'll talk about in a few seconds, much earlier on now. They're arriving on our campuses and our systems aren't ready. So they may be trying to apply, but it only says male or female, and their designation, now that this has been around for a bit in California and other areas, is an X or an O marker. And so, and states have varied what their markers might be. There's also the other side of that there are still states that won't allow folks to change that material, which is also problematic for people as they kind of navigate the world and really try to navigate the world and who they are, essentially. And so, yeah, no, that's a great question. And absolutely, I think we'll be seeing much more of that and much more conversations about what's going to be on those birth certificates and what needs to be on them in the future. So, but yeah, no, that's a larger national conversation that's absolutely happening. And so thinking about this, I do want to show a quick film or a quick video. And so I have it pulled up. I want to see if it should work. If it doesn't, I'll talk through it and then I'll send it out as a resource later.
Hair for the better part of a decade, because that was one of the first things you can do with a degree of plausible deniability in all of this. You can just be that kid who wants to have long hair and not really do anything else. So I grew it out starting at the end of high school.
My name's Hannah. I'm 30 years old. I live in Harlem, and I'm a medical student. I think my life is pretty ordinary. I think finding your identity is a universal thing, and I think introducing yourself again and again to people is a universal thing.
I used to put on full faces of makeup. It was nuts, but now this is the most makeup I almost ever do. I mean, the laser hair removal helps a lot, and the hormones, obviously. Coming into yourself and looking more typic for a female.
The way I explain this to people, sometimes I'll give them a pen, and I'll say, would you write your name, but with the other hand than you usually do? And they'll look at me and they say, that's kind of difficult. And I say, well, how long did it take you to realize that wasn't working for you? And they'll say, not that long at all. And I say, well, how do you know it's the wrong thing? And they'll say, I just know. And I'll say, exactly. That's the best way I can explain this part of my identity, is it's been as intrinsic to me as any other part of myself. It's not a fetish. It's not a phase. It's simply what is. So every 2 weeks, I give myself a shot of injectable estrogen. And this is because my body does not make the same hormones that other natal women's bodies do. There were definitely moments I was questioning this, definitely moments that I had to overcome. One of the big ones was as my transition loomed, I had to mourn myself and this guy who I was never perfectly fond of, but a lot of people were. And to say that this part of me, for whatever it was, perfect or otherwise, I don't get to keep building from. And that was terrifying. You don't actually think about when you're starting it, or even as you're going through it, that there's so much more to be gained from doing it than there is to be lost. This is my first purse from when I started going out as a female. Just a little something I worked up the courage to buy at a thrift shop, and I've been using it ever since, and I still do. This is probably about 8 to 10 years worth of going out as a woman. When I'm waking up in the morning, I don't have the dysphoria and I don't have the mental overhead that I did of here's another day that I feel like a girl, yet I'm going out as a guy. Now it's, I get up in the morning and I say I feel like a girl. How do I make myself look a little bit better as a girl? And that's what every other girl says. To be able to walk in and to buy women's shoes and not look weird for trying on women's shoes and not feel weird, even if nobody else is paying attention, it feels like everyone else is paying attention. And to be able to get to that point where you can just walk in and not have to think about it is an amazing experience. This is, in fact, the first apartment that I signed under my legal name, Hannah, and with that came a certain degree of joy and excitedness. This bedspread's special to me, actually, because I saw it and I loved it, but I wasn't quite female yet, and I didn't think I could pull it off until I was, so I bought it, and I hid it in my basement for about 3 years. Kind of a gift to myself for coming out, and I finally did. In the places I lived before, I was very concerned whenever I would go out of the house. I'd have to look and see through the peephole if somebody was at the doorway. I didn't want anybody to see me as if what I was doing was in some way shameful. Yet here, I can just walk out the door, and it's just no longer a concern what people are looking at, and it's just a concern of me getting on with my day. One of the reasons it took me many years until I was out of the house to start my process of becoming who I am is because I wanted to do it when I was a bit more independent and that it wouldn't impact my parents and my family, because coming out for me is also coming out for them. So I had to be prepared not just for how they were going to take it from me, but how the world was going to take it from them.
Good, how are you? Salam, what's up?
I think walking through the world as Hannah now has made me a more confident person. I think even my family has picked up on that in many ways. My mother, for example, one day I came downstairs, I was wearing my dress, I was wearing stockings, had my hair done, makeup done, and she looked at me and said, "Hannah, you look nice. I'm starting to get it. I have 3 daughters now and 1 son." And it was one of the nicest things she'd ever said to me, that it wasn't even an issue now of her having to get and consciously think of me as Hannah. It was she saw me now as her daughter and was actually kind of proud of the woman I've become. I think this is something that people are going to see their friends and their family members do, not because there are more trans people now than there were in the past, because there's something in the water or the air, but because we have created a society where we want to actually measure people by their character and by their content of their soul, and that this is a way to find that and be who you are.
So Hannah's story really does showcase some of the challenges that trans folks across the board will have with family, but also the process of coming to terms of oneself, but also broader societal notions. And so it's one representation of a trans-identified person or non-binary identified person navigating the world. And I do want to highlight some more, but I did want to give voice and make sure that we could walk through some of that experience and some of the thought process that folks would be having as they navigate some of the transition process and gender confirmation processes. Continuing kind of moving forward into terminology areas and clarifying some of that, as I noted earlier, transgender really is an umbrella. You may have seen this type of graphic online or in social media. There's lots of things that might and may not fall under here. The other term that has become much more commonplace is the term cisgender, and I did want to define that for a second. Cis, the prefix meaning same, is a person, and so if we're going to be very binary for a second, a cisgender identified person would be someone whose birth sex or sex assigned at birth matches their gender identity. So I identify as a man, but I was also assigned male at birth. So very binary specific. It's almost the opposite of transgender, just for sake of educational definition right now. Thinking of some of the more common pieces around trans-identified terminology, there's a few that fall under this umbrella or get linked under this umbrella that I want to clarify. The first three being some of those. Thinking of the word transvestite, transvestite is a dated word. I would steer us away from using that word and use the more modern day word cross-dressing. But cross-dressing is not what transgender identified folks feel. Cross-dressing is really about the feeling of dressing up in another gender's clothing for the feeling, not about wanting to be that person full time. Whereas a trans person, if maybe birth sex, very simple situation, maybe birth sex is male, but really wants to be a woman full time, knows themselves to be that, and that's just one type of experience. If we think about drag kings and queens, I do want to clarify this too as performance versus identity. These three, again, get linked underneath the trans umbrella often, and you will see some disdain and challenge by the community to have them removed or distanced from what trans-identified folks' experiences really are. These other terms, so androgyny, genderqueer, gender nonconforming, bigendered, and I can always send along, I have a list of emerging terminology around trans-related issues. These are all very similar yet very different based on individual experience. Androgyny is, historically a mixture of both male, both female, both man, woman. Genderqueer, if we think about the term queer being a radical act of blurring historical norms of gender and sexuality, genderqueer really is that blurring. It's not a exclusive masculine or feminine approach, but really is an approach of, I will identify how I feel in the moment. Gender nonconforming is breaking the conforming to the historical notions of masculinity and femininity. Bigendered, or the bi prefix meaning two, it's a mixture of the historical areas of masculinity and femininity. And then agender being the prefix meaning not or without a gender presentation. I would also add up here non-binary. These are some of the more common ones we are seeing on a day-to-day basis. And you will see folks identifying with a whole spectrum of other identities, but I wanted to at least provide some of the foundational knowledge that these are similar. The best thing I would instruct you to do is allow the person to self-define a bit more about if they've chosen a term, and a term you may or may not be familiar with, let them tell you about that. If you've built the trust with that person, allow them to go a bit deeper. In terms of these other ones up here, transsexual, I would also probably steer us away from using and really encourage you to use the term transgender as a broader umbrella term. Transsexual historically has been linked to medical related or pathology based information. And so transsexual, there are many folks that don't want to be reminded of biology in identity. And so transgender is the much broader umbrella. Two-spirit and third gender is relevant to Native and Indigenous communities. And so this has been, these folks have been the mystics, the shamans, the spiritual leaders of several Native and Indigenous communities. And there has been a resurgence of the recognition of these identities. But so some folks may, if they are blurring that gender spectrum, and they do have roots in Indigenous or Native communities, be using these terms. And then you may hear the term male to female or female to male, M to F or F to M, or you might hear AFAB or AMAB, assigned female at birth or assigned male at birth. So it's a recognition that someone assigned a specific biological sex to someone, but that is not how they any longer identify. And so there are lots more, but I did want to provide some of the foundations there with that umbrella. As we go forward with some of this content, the presentation is really formulated around questions we get asked often. So why are people trans? There are lots of theories and there's no conclusive reason why. So although cultural variation in sex and gender is vast. And so we know as we work with folks from across the globe in our space, the ways that we define gender norms are very different culturally. And so how someone might be identifying around gender nonconforming or gender queer presence might be very different than US or Western culture. Biology, medical theories, psychological factors, there's lots of theories. There is no conclusive evidence of why someone is trans. Many times, unfortunately, it's blaming the woman in the birthing process, which is completely sexist. And so it's, this woman has maybe, given birth over the 9 months and gave birth to this child. And a lot of the theories, the false theories that exist, but if you Google them, you'll see lots. It's blaming the mom for doing something in the process. Defute that if you hear that. There is no conclusive evidence at all. My biggest response to this, it's the person's right to choose, which gets complicated, especially with parents of youth who are trying to, depending on what that climate experience might be, it is a person's right to choose, but also figuring out how do you work within the dimensions of a family or educational community can be complicated. But again, there is no absolute conclusive evidence that I can give to you, but it's kind of circular. There's a whole bunch of factors that I think really do attribute to someone's identity. When we think about how many folks are there, no one knows. I would love to give you an exact number of how many folks in the world identify as trans, but we don't track this information. The closest information we have to this is the National Center for Transgender Equality's estimates around transsexual identified folks, and reminding us that I said that that's really medically based. In US healthcare, we have designation codes or health codes that attribute, the procedures that you've received in a doctor's office for payment with the health insurance. And so that 1/4 to 1% is by tracking those numbers. Not all or many don't ever receive, in the trans community, ever receive any type of medical care. There is no specific surgery. We'll talk about that in a second. But again, this number is probably pretty low. I would say probably in our college populations, our young adult populations, probably around 4% of our students are in the trans spectrum, whereas probably 8% to 10% are probably around the non-binary or gender fluid spectrum. And so that number continues to grow. And I think as Hannah had said in the video, it's not that there's something in the water. It really is, culture is changing, and the ways that we are allowing folks to break norms that we've had established for years, I think has been one of the reasons for us shifting culture. Some things to remember. Trans folks have always been part of the LGBT movement, the lesbian, gay, and bisexual civil rights movement. However, not all the trans or non-binary folks are going to want to be connected to that. Many times trans folks have been left out of those conversations. And so although you may say, oh, I was at this webinar that talked about LGBTQ issues, maybe you should talk to Brian, the LGBTQ director at Penn State. Many trans and non-binary folks might never want to be connected to that. And so they may actually just identify as a man or a woman and no relationship to their sex at birth. And so Trans folks identify as queer, straight, bisexual, gay, lesbian, asexual, and pansexual, just as non-trans people do. So again, clarifying the differences between sex and gender. So another question we get is really around pronouns. So how do we address folks? How do we enter into conversations with folks, but not other them from the start? And there is a video that I can share after this that's pretty direct, but I did want to just talk on this briefly. In terms of trans and non-binary populations and welcoming people into spaces, it may be awkward, but my biggest recommendation is to use they, them, theirs as a singular form for folks versus using he or she in terms of gender inclusive pronoun usage. The grammar gods that be have said that they, them, and theirs can be used singularly and plural fashion. There's a really great article that was done in the New York Times just about 7 months ago, that talked about the history of they, them, theirs as singular and plural. And so it may be awkward. I would encourage you to practice with colleagues, but many times, I tend to default only to they, them, theirs for everyone until someone tells me differently. But it does allow for a broader conversation. It also allows for folks to ask questions. So if someone asks you why or who is that person bringing with them, if you've said that they are bringing somebody at 6 o'clock that evening to your office, and they ask who are they bringing with them because it might be recognized as a plural form, it's your point of saying, well, actually, I'm just welcoming people into a broader conversation around dimensions of gender. And so we always are asking about how we can be an ally for communities. That's one way of changing subtle language, removing he or /she from forms, and really allowing folks to self-identify or using, the students or the workforce or the community versus specific gender designated words. So with all of that in mind, a lot of this stuff gets linked to psychology and identity. And a lot of that goes back to the word transsexual and medical related issues in the past. And so, when we are trying to connect with trans folks or non-binary folks, sometimes it goes and steers right into healthcare related conversations, but I wanted to share why that sometimes happens and why we might want to think about broader cultural changes so that we don't just go down this pathology-based path. Historically, and to this present day, trans-related issues are in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Historically, it was called transsexualism, and then it morphed into gender identity disorder. And then current day in the DSM, it's called gender dysphoria. There is lots of challenges to this designation in the DSM. Those that are pro-classification, historically, gender identity disorder also encompassed fetishes as well as sexual dysfunctions. And so gender dysphoria in the current diagnosis that folks will get for access to medical care really has removed that. It's more appropriate to the identity and the experience that trans and non-binary folks are encountering. But it's still pathology-based. It's still in this book of medical criteria. It's still reinforcing that people are going to be man or woman, which isn't always the case. This is very similar to the conversation around homosexuality and why we don't use homosexuality as a term often anymore. 1973, homosexuality was removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And so hopefully, as long as folks can still secure access to medical care, this one day will be removed from that as well. So if someone does decide to transition, and again, folks are transitioning younger in life, there are things called hormone blockers that will halt puberty, and some parents are electing to allow their child to start on these puberty blockers earlier in life. And so, but what does transitioning really mean? And so I wanted to give this, we don't always get to ask these questions when all of a sudden we're confronted with a student or a colleague or someone else who is possibly going through some type of transition related to their identity. And so folks can transition in multiple ways. Transitioning can be medical, legal, and or social from one gender to another. social transitioning for folks, and some folks might only socially transition. They may never go down the medical route. Can be names and or pronouns, behaviors, appearance, clothes changes, voice changes. Here at University Park, we have a voice clinic where folks actually work on the tone of their voice and how someone might be speaking more masculinely or more femininely. And so the influx of voice is also really important for allowing someone to pass and also be safe in the world. In terms of medical transitioning, it can be hormones, it can be various surgeries. There's a standards of care by the World Professional Association for Transgender Health that folks will follow. And so if you've ever heard, have you had the surgery or the sex change surgery, I want us all to defute that as educators. There isn't just a surgery, and it really isn't a sex change surgery. There's many other options and surgical procedures that folks will opt into that really isn't about sex. It's about being able to present in a way that's safe and in sync with the gender that someone knows themselves to be. So talking about those standards of how someone how they might transition. Again, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health has some guidelines that you might be working with a parent or a family member who their child just started talking about this, and so the standards of care are helpful in thinking about what this thinking through with this parent what their child might or how they might obtain access to resources, and so. Those procedures, while they're also refuted in many ways, they do provide some guidance, but not all folks should or will follow them. The recommendations is that folks who are thinking about this gender dysphoria or this feeling that my body doesn't fit who I am will be directed to counseling usually. They'll also be asked to do some type of real life experience or a trial period in that gender they know themselves to be. And I'm not talking just masculine or feminine presentation. It could be a whole androgynous presentation as well. Then talk about some available medical options and procedures. A therapist and a physician will usually submit a letter of readiness, usually to healthcare for access if someone's healthcare does cover some of the transition-related benefits. And then and only then will someone elect into hormone therapy. And then after that, they'll be able to possibly engage in various surgeries. And so the problem with this is it does create barriers, and it is really still positioning folks to be told in a world that even though they know who they are in the world tells them when they can be that person. And so that's why a lot of this is still refuted by the community of why do we have to do this? And much of it is still rooted in U.S. healthcare and payments. And so in order to get your procedures paid for, you will have to receive a code for your healthcare access or your procedures, and then the medical insurance will pay for that. But again, wanted to highlight some of this just for you to know what some of these folks might be engaging in, or if you're working with a parent, you can have some of this in your mind about what they might be navigating with their child. And so hormones, what do they do? So you might be working with youth that are engaging in hormone therapy. Estrogen softens the skin, redistributes body fat, reduces some body hair, and alters the mood. Testosterone for female to male identified folks lowers the voice, causes the growth of body and facial hair, redistributes body fat to a more masculine appearance, and causes the menstrual cycle to end. One thing to note that, as people transition earlier and earlier in life, testosterone on female-bodied, biologically bodied individuals actually does lessen one's lifespan. That is, and so people know this going into this process, but it is more important to be who they know themselves to be in the world than to worry about how many years they will live. And so these critical decisions are made really early on. And so it's powerful to think about, it is so important for that person to be who they know themselves to be. And I do want to call out some of those things, because when you think about how the decisions that people make, these are really well thought out and really well considered decisions. They don't just always happen. And so thinking about what type of surgeries might be happening, especially for transsexual identified communities, so this is the medical-based changes, there is no surgery. And I would also ask that we don't call it the sex change surgery, but rather move to gender confirmation or gender affirmation procedures it really is affirming someone's gender they know themselves to be. It's confirming someone's gender. We're not changing sex. We are in some ways, but it's not about that. It's a holistic approach to who this person is. And those procedures can range. It can be genital reconstructive, it can be facial reconstruction, breast removal or augmentation, removal of the ovaries and uterus, as well as reducing the Adam's apple and or changing of the thorax. And so there's a whole bunch of procedures. And I share this just so that, again, to refute that, have you had the surgery? Folks may never have the surgery. Some may opt into certain pieces of this. Some will be able to afford this. Much of this is not covered by insurance. Even in the most affirming insurances or healthcare policies, a lot of this is considered cosmetic, which it really isn't. It's about allowing someone to be safe in the world. But a lot of these procedures are costly. And then once someone gets through some of the medical stuff, there's all of the other things and legal steps that folks need to take. And if you remember, I give the example often of the Staples easy button. There's no easy button to hit to change all of this stuff. There's legal name and gender changes to the courts, driver's licenses, social security accounts, passports, bank accounts, credit cards, paychecks, leases, medical records, birth certificates, and academic records. It varies by state. Some states will not allow the birth certificate to be altered at all, and then a lot of this process stops entirely for folks. Some folks are able to do certain parts of this, and in the statistics I'll share in a few moments, you'll see, there's a majority of folks that still aren't able to transition all of their documents, and again, it's costly. I'm just reading. Oh yes, absolutely, Hannah. A huge misconception that I've run into is that in order to be really trans, you need to undergo medical transition. There's no one way to be trans, and due to the high cost and legal gatekeeping, the majority of trans people never medically transition. Absolutely, and so thanks for that note, Hannah. I think what's really also interesting related to that is many of the younger generation folks that I have the privilege of working with, historically, and there's a divide between generations in the trans community, many of our non-binary and trans folks, younger folks, are not opting into the surgeries. And yes, there's cost pieces to that, but actually are finding other ways to transition that aren't just the medical pieces. Whereas I think there's also a divide in the community that older generations have also said you need to transition medically, whereas some of these other folks are also at this divide of, I'm never going to opt into medical stuff because I've been able to find a way of being in the world that works for me, and I don't need the medical world to tell me who I'm going to be. And so absolutely. So yeah, thank you so much for that note, Hannah. That makes perfect sense, and I think it's where our students are and where many folks are told of how they should be in the world and what they need to do to be who they are in the world. So thinking about some of the reality check stuff and some of the recent stats, I wanted to give you a good high-level overview of what trans folks are experiencing. And this is at every age level. And so the most recent largest subset of data is the 2015 US Trans Survey. They have done this data and broken out the data. They're still mining the data. They did this survey in 2012, redid it in 2015, and they're going to be doing it again. It's around a 3 or 4 year cycle. But it does encompass all of the things that trans and non-binary folks are experiencing in every facet of life. And so thinking of family support, you all work with families, I'm sure, in some form. 10% of respondents in the survey had family members that were violent towards them. 8% of respondents were kicked out of the house. And I'm going to kind of go through some of this high-level stuff, but 40% have attempted suicide in their life. That's nearly 9 times the rate of the US population. And it's not because they're not considering suicide because they don't know who they are, or they're engaging mental health resources because they need help figuring out who they are. The challenges and the coping mechanisms are really based in a world that has not been designed to receive them for who they are in the world. So thinking about this, a lot of the anxiety, the depression that we see amongst trans and non-binary and lesbian, gay, and bi folks is really about the world and the interaction with the world that has not been affirming. 7% have attempted suicide in the past year. That's nearly 12 times the rate of the US population. So thinking of high-risk populations, our trans folks are absolutely there. These numbers escalate when you think about multiple marginalizations and trans folks of color. That 40% jumps up to 64% for trans folks of color. 46% of respondents were verbally harassed, 9% of respondents were physically attacked, 47% of respondents were sexually assaulted. Just to kind of give you a highlight for Penn State, if we think about sexual violence, we tend to default to female undergraduate students being the perceived population that experiences the most sexual violence. That is actually, the LGBT community at Penn State and many institutions of higher education are the highest number of folks that are experiencing sexual violence, gender-based harassment, sexual assaults on a campus. And it is, 1 in 4 of us undergraduate students and a higher number for also our graduate populations will experience sexual violence while they're with us. And I think on here, there's another stat in K through 12 where experiences of folks who identified as trans in K through 12, they were verbally harassed 54%, not allowed to dress in the way that fit their gender identity 52%, disciplined 36% for fighting back against bullies, physically attacked because folks thought they were trans 24%, disciplined more harshly because teachers thought they were trans 20%, left of school because mistreatment was so bad, sexually assaulted 13% of K through 12 youth, trans youth, expelled from school 6%, and then 1 or more of the experiences listed above 77%. And so K through 12 numbers are high. And so as this is becoming much more visible in these spaces, absolutely these issues are becoming much more present. In employment, 16% reported losing a job, 23% who had reported other forms of mistreatment based on their gender identity and expression, such as being allowed to use a restroom that matches their identity, being told to present to the wrong gender, or other people sharing their private information. It is important to note that trans identity status has been recognized as HIPAA-protected medical information. And so for us, sharing that information amongst folks that isn't a business need or a specific educational need can actually have some pretty dire consequences for the person, but also in HIPAA protection. 30% of respondents who had a job reported being fired, denied promotion, or other forms of mistreatment. 77% of respondents hid transition or gender transition or quit their job because they couldn't be who they were. Healthcare, 25% were denied coverage, 55% who sought transition-related benefits were denied, 33% who saw a healthcare provider had at least one negative experience. Many folks do not see a doctor because they were mistreated as a trans person, or if we think about the multiple marginalizations and socioeconomic divide, many couldn't afford it or didn't have access to it. Public accommodations, 1/4 experience, or 23%, some form of housing discrimination. 30% of trans and non-binary folks have experienced homelessness. 26% avoided staying in a shelter because of fear of mistreatment. 70% who did actually elect to shelters were kicked out of the shelter or harassed or sexually or physically assaulted. Respondents experience high levels of mistreatment and harassment by police. Many times trans folks are read as sex workers and not taken seriously when things are reported. And this is national standard. This is, again, across the US. 57% of respondents said they would feel uncomfortable asking the police for help. And of course, that number rises as we think about multiple marginalizations present in one's identity. Public accommodations, denied equal treatment, verbally harassed, or physically assaulted in all of these areas. So many times, oftentimes, a lot of this discrimination is about my ID doesn't match, or someone perceived that I was just not man enough or woman enough. And it's anywhere from public transportation issues, gym or health club issues, Department of Motor Vehicles, identities not being able to correlate, being denied services at a court or courthouse, or being denied privileges or things by legal attorneys or representation. So the numbers are all relatively still high. While we're endeavoring to make change, the realities are still pretty harsh. 1 in 10 in terms of public accommodations were denied, or 9% denied access to a restroom. 32% of respondents limited the amount they ate or drank during the day to avoid the restroom. More than half, 59% of respondents avoided using a public restroom because they were afraid of confrontations or other problems that they might experience. And so, even here at Penn State, we have our policies that say that, we do have all user or gender inclusive restroom facilities. We also have the option in policy, and this goes back to Title IX and Title VII, that individuals based on their gender identity and known gender identity, not what we tell them who they are, but who they know themselves to be, can use the sex designated facility that fits them, or the gender designated facility that fits them. So if they know themselves to be a man, they can use the men's restroom. Same thing for if they identify as a woman. We can't police them, we give options. And so, and I think we shouldn't be policing them. And so I know many places have had those types of conversations, especially in K through 12. And so we should not be policing people. Many school districts have lost those conversations in court, even in Pennsylvania, where they were policing students' access to facilities. ID documents, just going closely on this, and I am aware of time, so we are almost towards the end here. 11% of respondents had a name and gender they chose and preferred, while 2/3, still 68%, none of their IDs matched their gender they chose or preferred. Cost of changing IDs was a major problem. They couldn't afford it. Again, there's no easy button. There's not one cost. Not everything works so easily through the systems. 33% of respondents have an ID with an inaccurate name or gender presentation, and those folks were sexually harassed or verbally harassed, denied benefits to service, asked to leave, or assaulted. Again, when things don't match, people are told to leave, and they can't get access to the environments they were hoping. Some stuff about spiritual and religious communities, 19% were rejected, but although 42% of that 19% actually found a more affirming community, so that gives us hope. Unemployment rate is 3 times higher than the unemployment rate in the US population, which is 5% for US population. As you think about multiple marginalizations, those numbers go up for all of these other racial and ethnicity-based differences. Middle Eastern, American Indian, multiracial, Latino, Latina, Black respondents, there's going to be higher rates of unemployment. Nearly 1/3 were living in poverty, nearly twice the rate of the US population. And so that's a grim picture, but I think it is important to recognize some of the realities that folks might be encountering as they come into conversation with you. I do want to talk about some tips as we wrap up in terms of creating an inclusive community. Don't use any of this terminology. So tranny, she-male, he-she, transvestite, hermaphrodite, sex change operation. It is completely dehumanizing. Bio-male and bio-female, don't remind people who they were biologically. Folks want to be who they are and who they are presently. So reminding them can actually be tremendously hurtful. Always call the person by the chosen name and preferred pronoun they choose, or the chosen pronoun. If you screw up, apologize and move on. Respectfully ask how someone would like to be addressed if you're not sure. If records or systems are populating information that's incorrect, it is appropriate to ask, and then hopefully guide that conversation and build trust with that individual. Be aware that records may be incongruent. Remember, everyone can't change their IDs. Never out someone as trans. Remember some of the statistics we went over. Ask yourself why you're outing them, who's it benefiting, and remember the impact. Those statistics are still, can be completely shattering. Many folks who are perceived to be trans are killed every year just because people find out or again assume that they are trans. Some folks will never be identifying as trans or non-binary and won't consider themselves trans. Honor that privacy. Never ask a person if they've had the surgery or plan to. It's not cosmetic or superfluous. It's about really who they are in the world and allowing them to be that in the world. And most of it's not covered by insurance. Refrain from reminding trans, non-binary folks how different they might look than before. In any type of work environment, we shouldn't be talking about bodies at all. And so thinking about complimenting someone's body for whatever or how they look is actually inappropriate. And so we should steer clear of that for everyone, not just trans and non-binary folks. Resist the urge to place people in boxes, the man or woman box. Remember, again, after all of the information we've reviewed, many folks may never identify as either or. And again, don't assume that someone's sexual orientation is or might be. And so as we move forward, I do always ask, what in your own personal level can you do in your personal life? Professionally, with your specific role, what can you do in your role? How can you embed this stuff in your day-to-day work? And, here's, one I post often to folks across Penn State. What are the policies and procedures that you interact with daily that you might not have control of, but others might, that you can foster change? And so thinking about that, there's a good deal of national resources that can always be found on our website. So all of the links to these organizations are on our website. My biggest recommendation is actually the Gender Spectrum Center here, genderspectrum.org. And I'm going to pull quickly just onto the screen, and I'm actually going to put the link to this in the chat box. Genderspectrum.org has some really great educational resources and practices, and how to really embed this in a day-to-day environment. And I know John just asked you, any of your schools have a policy specific to transgender? Have they addressed this with you? So thinking about that for everyone, there's some really good, if you don't have those recommendations or haven't been through those experiences, Gender Spectrum Center, I gave the specific page there with that link in terms of general resources, legal and policy issues, gender inclusive schools, which gives some really easy steps to think about expanding your culture, and supporting gender expansive students, gender in sports. There's a whole bunch here. So I'm going to move that to the side, but that link is there. And then State College, if you are local to us or close to us, we have a bunch of resources. Equality Pennsylvania works across the state of Pennsylvania. We also have resources across the state because we serve the 24 campuses. So if there's ever anything that you would like some more further direction, please do feel free to reach out to us, and we'll try to connect you to some resources that are geographically close. And so I do end, I know it's 4:37, and I'm sure you have all had long days, but the trans flag is this flag that's pictured right here on the slide. Monica Helms designed this flag. Although the rainbow flag does serve as this kind of umbrella flag for the community, each community within this broader concept have their own. And so this is the trans flag. And so Monica Helms designed this so that the stripes at the top or bottom are light blue, traditional color for baby boys. The stripes next to them are pink, the traditional color for baby girls. The stripe in the middle is white for those who are intersex, transitioning, or consider themselves having a neutral or undefined gender. The pattern is such that no matter which way you fly it, it is always correct, signifying trans and non-binary folks finding correctness in their lives. And so when you do see this flag, you'll know what this recognition's for. It does have meaning in very different ways than what the rainbow flag has for the larger queer and gender and sexual diverse communities. But our general office email is on this slide. And again, I will share my email is bjp226@psu.edu. And so with that, if there are questions, I'm just looking at the responses to John. When we have a trans student on our roster, that student teachers are told the student's preferred name and their gender pronouns. That's good. That's very good, Lindsay. I think we, in terms of higher education context and some of the local schools that we've been working with, we're trying to endeavor to create systems and fix systems that haven't been able to be flexible in terms of chosen name and chosen gender and pronoun. And so we are always constantly endeavoring to do that. But no, that is a good process and a good policy. Cool. Anyone have any questions for the chat? Feel free. I'll hang on here. Any other things that might be helpful? But again, I do want to thank you all for the time today. And thank you for the opportunity, John, to spend some time with all of you and providing some of this foundational context.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brian. That was a fantastic presentation. Please, now's your opportunity. I know we ran a couple minutes over, but if anybody has any questions whatsoever that you feel session here, please use this opportunity. Of course, if you'd like to perhaps ask Brian a question privately or after the recording has stopped, we can also hang on for that as well. But please utilize this opportunity. Just simply unmute or use the chat box. Anybody have anything out there that they're curious about, wondering about, scenarios they'd like advice on? Okay. Well, if anybody thinks of anything as we progress towards the conclusion here, again, feel free to unmute yourself or just use the chat box. But again, thank you, Brian. That was absolutely fantastic. And we appreciate you spending the past hour sharing your expertise with us. This is certainly a topic as we explore how we truly become Ag Ed for All as part of the national initiative. And as Brian mentioned, this originated, a lot of the policy and law originated regarding sports. However, as ag teachers, we do take a lot of overnight trips with students. We take a lot of FFA trips with students where, rooming assignments and making sure that appropriate restroom facilities, and this is an issue that very, very, very likely could enter into your program that you're going to have to address and make sure that all appropriate accommodations are being met, so that we are being inclusive and truly opening up the world of agricultural education for everybody. So unless anybody, I see a couple, Matt has a question about training resources. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, but so in terms of the training resources who facilitate overnight experiences with students, that's always a big one. And depending on the age range too, how that works. Gender Spectrum, so the one resource I shared here, has some interesting stuff. So if you go under teens and social services and education, they have some really good guidance there. I think, it is complicated. It depends on age range, parents, what was the parent context in the beginning. Rooming is always a challenge of how do we room people? Do we room by sex? Do we room by gender? And so I'm always more than willing to work through some of those individual logistics. There's not a ton of national guidance. Gender Spectrum is probably the best in terms of some of their written guidance on here and the rights and how to navigate that. But I'm more than willing to talk offline if you want to kind of go deeper about the overnight experiences you're facilitating.
Sure, and I mean, I don't mind. I don't know if y'all can hear me well enough with the mic situation, but yeah, so part of that with registration for our programming, the way it's written is that people select gender based on identity, and then they are roomed based off that selected gender identity.
Okay.
And then from there, so one, I guess I was looking for guidance on like, that is something that we just instituted when I came on, or before I came on staff for this current season. And then moving forward, I asked about training the staff, one, so that they're able to explain to teachers and stakeholders who maybe have questions on site at the conference. But in my experience, that there have been questions that have come from parents of other participants who may not feel comfortable. And our policy is not, our policy is that we support the students in their decisions, and that if the parents or student will make accommodations, but we're not kicking anybody out of rooms or anything like that. And so I'm just curious if, and that was not very well articulated, but
It was.
I guess right. I'm just curious if there are resources out there that we could be looking at, that I could be looking at. So in March, when I start training staff for the summer, that I can be prepared to kind of help coach them through those conversations that they may or may not need to have with teachers or students who are going through the programs.
Absolutely. So actually underneath that one page that I shared, I was just kind of clicking through because I know I've used a few of the resources in here with some of the camps and some of the offices I worked with across Penn State. The registration form you were talking about was actually, so they include under gender inclusive schools on that site. The gender inclusive registration forms is one of the areas that has been really helpful in thinking about. And I know I just saw, let me see, where was it? Hannah asked the question about binary genders and non-binary genders. How do you make them feel welcome? I've digressed to the guidance of, yes, absolutely, we do this. And then the other, we will room that person based on their response to those things. If someone does identify as non-binary or genderqueer, I would always put a check mark, and we've done this with our housing on campus environments here, or for camps we're hosting on campus. If you would like to have a conversation with a staff member about your specific need, my big thing is that we need to follow up on that if we do add that check mark, to make sure that their living arrangement is good for them. So it may be, what's the bathroom situation? What's the most ideal living environment or rooming environment for them? So yes, like a form is great, and what you said about your form is great, and how the policies you do that, and you don't police those things. So that's tremendous first steps. But thinking deeper about how, if there's an option for folks to check off of, I'd like to talk more about my specific needs. It really is about universal design and accessibility rather than a trans or non-binary related issue.
Okay.
And so that, in many ways, following some of that guidance of, we're thinking more broadly about how do we facilitate the safety of and the experience that's going to be best for you. And so that those personal connections allow for that developmental conversation to happen too. The other thing on this gender spectrum, I feel like is my go-to, especially for camps and overnight experiences. There's some really good, easy talking points. So instead of sitting through an hour presentation, I just had it up on my other screen. The learning more about gender resources are really basic, but if you're talking to folks that don't have a deep knowledge of this, and you just want basic information without going into a trans and gender inclusion 101 workshop, these are the ways, some of these easy resources that Gender Spectrum is putting out there are things that I'm recommending to parents, families, and educators. I don't work for Gender Spectrum, but in many ways I feel like I do, because their resources are really good and really, thinking forward. And so hopefully, if you have some moments to click through those, and if you want to talk through that offline, absolutely feel free to do that after today. Other questions? Training resources. Additionally, this webinar will post in the center. Okay, just making sure. I don't think. Are there any more questions that I'm missing going through the chat? So if not, thank you all again. And again, please do bjp226@psu.edu. Feel free to reach out. And if any of these resources aren't the perfect fit, we can do some digging and find some other ones that might be helpful to your work. So thank you again for the really good questions. I think, yeah, there's lots of that you're all considering all of this work. So thank you again.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brian. Thank you to everybody who signed on and joined us today. This was a great presentation. We had a great attendance, great questions. I appreciate everybody that has logged on and participated. Did make it very interactive for us. If nobody else has any questions for Brian, I am going to steal the screen here for a second and put in a plug for some up and coming webinars. Everybody see I think I shared the right one. Next Wednesday, October 10th from 3:30 to 4:30, the first series of the Connect to Industry series with Ian Groy from Bartlett Tree Expert Services. We'll be leading a discussion for us on applied plant and soil science as it relates to the arboriculture industry, how professionals take theory and put it into practice using real world examples every day. And as another part of that series, to give you a sneak peek to all of the other presentations coming up throughout the fall here. November, we'll be highlighting the landscaping industry, and December, we will have a representative from Case New Holland join us to talk about the needs of the welding industry. So with that, unless anybody has any last minute questions, Brian's email is there in the chat box. And if you would like to get in contact with him, you can, of course, always come through me, and I can put you in touch with Brian. Once again, thank you to all. And unless there's any questions, we can adjourn, and I will stop the recording.